The word hit Mamie Dawson like a fist to the sternum. Not a slap, not a sting. A full, bone-deep blow that stole every last particle of air from her lungs and left her standing in the middle of the Caldwell General Store with her hands pressed flat against the wooden counter, knuckles white as bleached cotton, fighting the absolute certainty that her legs were about to betray her and drop her to the sawdust floor. "Bankrupt," said Mr. Hensley again, as if saying it twice would somehow make it gentler, as if repetition could sand down the jagged edges of a word that had just ended everything she had spent the last 4 years building from nothing. He slid the ledger across the counter with both hands like a man laying flowers on a casket, and he had the decency, at least, to look away. "I am sorry, Miss Dawson. The debt your father left behind, it is more than the store can carry, more than you can carry." Mamie did not cry. She had not cried in so long that she was no longer entirely sure the mechanism still worked inside her. She looked at the numbers in the ledger, at her own handwriting filling the columns for the past 4 years, at every careful economy she had practiced, every dawn she had dragged herself out of a cold bed to open the store before the other merchants, every Sunday she had skipped church to do inventory, every winter meal she had halved so that her younger brother Cody could eat his full portion. And she thought, clearly and without drama, that she had done everything right and it had not been enough. "How long do I have?" she asked, and her voice was so steady that Hensley flinched. "The bank will send someone from Abilene by Friday week," he said. 10 days, 10 days." She nodded once, picked up the ledger, tucked it under her arm, and walked out of the store into the blazing Kansas sun of June 1882 without a single word more. She did not cry walking down the main street of Caldwell. She did not cry when she passed the barber and the blacksmith and old Mrs. Prout, who watched her from behind a curtain with sharp, knowing eyes. She did not cry when she got back to the cramped back room of the store that had served as a home since her father's death, when she sat down on the edge of the cot and held the ledger in her lap and stared at the wall. She thought about her father, Hector Dawson, who had been warm and enormous and laughing, who had extended credit to every struggling family in Caldwell without ever writing it down properly, who had borrowed against the store 3 separate times to cover the gaps, and who had died of a heart seizure 18 months ago, leaving behind a 19-year-old daughter, a 16-year-old son, and a debt so tangled it took Mamie 6 months just to understand the shape of it. She thought about Cody, who was 20 now and working at the livery stable on the other side of town, who had no idea how bad things had gotten because Mamie had been careful, so very careful not to let him see it. She thought about the families who bought their flour and their salt and their thread and their lamp oil on credit from her store, the Garcias and the Websters and the Havorsons, the families who could not afford the Hartfield Mercantile across the street because Mr. Hartfield did not extend credit to anyone and looked at Mexican and immigrant families as though they were livestock wandering into his clean establishment. She had kept the store going for all of them. She had kept herself going for all of them. And now the bank was coming in 10 days. It was on the 3rd day after that meeting, on a Tuesday morning when the heat was already punishing before 8 o'clock and the dust hung motionless in the air, that Luke Alden rode into Caldwell. He came from the north, which meant he had come down from the Alden Cattle Range, a piece of land so vast that the locals talked about it with a particular reverence that was 1 part admiration and 2 parts resentment. The Alden spread covered nearly 4,000 acres of good Kansas grass, enough grazing land to support a herd of over 300 head, and it had been built by Luke's father, Edmund Alden, over 30 years of brutal, unceasing work. Edmund had died 2 years ago, leaving the ranch to his only son. Luke Alden rode a steel-gray horse named Cannon, and he rode it the way some men seem to be born knowing how, with a loose ease that looked like indifference until you watched long enough to notice that he was actually in constant, quiet conversation with the animal beneath him. He was 31 years old, broad through the shoulders, with dark brown hair that needed cutting and a jaw that needed shaving and eyes the color of deep creek water in the shade. That particular shifting gray-green that can look cold from a distance and quite remarkably warm up close. He tied Cannon at the post outside Caldwell General Store because it was the closest post to the hardware supplier he needed to visit, and because the Alden Ranch had always done its supply shopping with the Dawson store when Edmund was alive, and Luke saw no particular reason to change that habit even if the old man was gone, and a young woman was running the place now. He pushed open the door and the little brass bell rang and Mamie Dawson looked up from behind the counter where she was taking inventory of the tinned goods, and their eyes met for the first time. She saw a rancher, big, quiet, probably wanting something in a hurry. He saw a young woman with dark circles under her eyes and ink stains on her fingers, and a ledger open in front of her, and a quality of contained exhaustion in her expression that he recognized. Not because he had seen it often in others, but because he had seen it every morning in his own mirror for the 2 years since his father died, and the weight of 4,000 acres and 300 cattle and a crew of 11 men had settled onto his shoulders like a physical thing. "Morning," he said, pulling off his hat. "Luke Alden. My father used to order wire and fence posts through here." "I know who you are, Mr. Alden," Mamie said. "It was a small town. Everyone knew everyone." "What can I get for you?" He gave her the order: 200 yards of barbed wire, 40 fence posts, lamp oil, grain, a set of new buckles for the harness, and she wrote it down efficiently without asking him to repeat anything, her handwriting fast and clean. "I can have the wire and the posts ready by Thursday," she said. "The rest I can fill today." "Thursday is fine." He put his hat back on, then paused, not because he had forgotten anything on the list. He paused because he was looking at her again, at the particular way she was holding herself, straight and still and deliberate, like a person who was working very hard to appear as though nothing was wrong. He had been doing exactly that for 2 years. "You all right?" he asked. The question was so unexpected, so entirely outside the transaction that had just taken place between them, that Mamie actually went still for a full 3 seconds. She stared at him. It was not an unfriendly stare, but it was the stare of a person who has been asked something they cannot immediately locate in any familiar category. "I am fine, Mr. Alden," she said. "Thank you for the order. I will have it ready by Thursday." He nodded and left, and Mamie turned back to her tinned goods and told herself firmly that the warmth she felt moving through her chest was irritation at being observed and absolutely nothing else. Thursday came, and the order was ready, and Luke Alden came back with his wagon and 2 hands from the ranch to load the wire and the posts. He paid promptly and in full, which was unusual enough that Mamie noticed it with a small internal flinch, because it reminded her of how many other accounts were not paid promptly, and how the sum of those absences was the entire reason the bank was coming in 4 days. He looked at her again as his hands loaded the wagon. That same noticing look, the one that felt less like scrutiny and more like careful attention, and she found she did not know what to do with it. "You are still not all right," he said. It was not a question this time. It was a simple, quiet statement, and it landed somewhere in Mamie's chest with a precision that made her breath catch. "Mr. Alden," she said, keeping her voice measured, "I appreciate the concern. I am running a business. I am fine." He looked at her for another moment. Then he nodded and he said, "If you ever need anything, Miss Dawson, the Alden Ranch is always in need of supplies. You can count on our business." And then he was gone again, and Mamie stood in the doorway of the store and watched the wagon roll north and thought, with a clarity that frightened her a little, that he was the first person in 4 years who had looked at her as though she might be a person carrying something heavy rather than simply a person who was good at carrying things. The bank's man arrived from Abilene on the morning of the 10th day. His name was Garrett Foss, and he wore a suit that was too fine for Caldwell, and had the smooth, pleasant manner of a man who had delivered bad news so many times that it no longer troubled him. He brought papers. He brought a representative from Hartfield Mercantile, which was the part that made Mamie's stomach clench, because she understood immediately what that meant. Hartfield wanted the store. Of course he did. He had wanted it since her father was alive and had always resented that the Dawson store existed at all, that it drew customers he felt were rightfully his. "The terms are straightforward," Foss said, sitting across from her at the small table in the back room. "The debt is $462. The bank is prepared to take the building and stock in settlement, or you may find a buyer by the end of the month who will pay that sum and allow you to retain any surplus." "And if Hartfield buys it?" Mamie asked. Foss looked faintly uncomfortable. "That would be a matter between you and Mr. Hartfield. The families who buy on credit here," she said carefully. "The Garcia family, the Havorsons, the Websters, the Brunner family, they cannot afford Hartfield's prices, and Mr. Hartfield does not extend credit. If he buys this store and closes it, those families will have nowhere to go." Foss arranged his papers. "Miss Dawson, that is a concern outside the scope of the—" "I am aware of what it is outside the scope of," she said. Still that quiet voice, still that terrible steadiness. "I am telling you so that you understand what is at stake. I will find a buyer." She did not know how. She had no idea how. But she said it with such absolute certainty that Foss actually wrote something in his notes before he left. Mamie sat alone in the back room for a long time after he left. The evening light came through the small window in stripes of dusty gold, and the store was quiet, and she sat with her hands folded on the table and felt the full, crushing weight of everything she had been holding up for 4 years begin to press down in a way that she could not entirely push back. She thought about her mother, who had died when Cody was born, whom Mamie remembered in fragments: a warm hand, a particular smell of rosewater, a voice singing something soft on a dark night. She thought about being 12 years old and understanding, with the solemn practicality of a child who has lost one parent and cannot afford to lose her grip on the other, that she had to become useful immediately or the world would not hold together. She had been useful. She had been strong. She had managed and organized and planned and economized and swallowed every fear and every grief and every moment of exhaustion, and she had held it all together through sheer refusal to let it fall, and now it was falling anyway, and she was 23 years old and she was so tired. She did not cry, but she pressed her hands flat on the table and breathed through her nose and told herself, the way she always did, that she could fall apart later, that there was no time for it now. In the morning she would figure something out. She did not figure it out in the morning. She spent the morning behind the counter, as she always did, measuring out flour and salt for Mrs. Garcia, who paid what she could and always thanked Mamie with a warmth that felt like something Mamie needed more than she understood, and she tried to think past the panic that kept rising in her throat and kept swallowing it back down. It was mid-morning when Luke Alden came in again, and this time he had not sent word ahead and he was not there for supplies. He came in, pulled off his hat the same way he always did, and he stood at the counter and he looked at her, and this time the looking was different. This time it was the look of a man who has done some thinking between one visit and the next. "I heard Foss was here," he said. "Caldwell was a small town." News traveled the way wind traveled, invisibly and instantly and without any particular respect for privacy. Mamie straightened. "Mr. Alden, I am not here to pry," he said, with a directness that cut through whatever defense she was preparing. "I am here because I want to make you an offer." She looked at him cautiously. "The Alden Ranch needs a supply arrangement," he said. "Formal, contracted, consistent. Feed, grain, hardware, sundry goods. It costs me time and money to send a wagon into Abilene every time we run short of something. I would rather have a standing arrangement with a local store." He paused. "A store that is going to be here long term." Mamie was quiet for a moment. She understood what he was doing. He was building a bridge that would let her walk across it without having to admit she needed one. The practical shape of the offer, a contracted supply arrangement with the Alden Ranch, would bring in enough consistent revenue to begin addressing the debt, possibly enough to begin negotiating a payment plan with the bank instead of a forced sale. The question was why. "Mr. Alden," she said carefully, "that is a generous offer. I want to understand what you are getting in exchange." "I told you," he said, "convenience, reliable local supply. You could get that from Hartfield." Something shifted in his expression. Not irritation, something more complicated than that. "Hartfield charges full price on everything and gives nothing back to the community he draws from. My father believed that how you do business matters as much as what you get out of it." He paused again. "I believe that too." Mamie looked at him for a long moment. She thought about pride, about the particular ache of needing help after spending 4 years being the person who gave it to others. She thought about Mrs. Garcia and the Havorsons and the Bruners, about Cody's steady salary at the livery that was not quite enough to save the store, but was enough to keep him from knowing how bad it was. "What are your terms?" she asked. They sat down at the small table in the back room, the same table where Foss had sat the day before, and Luke Alden spread out a simple, handwritten list of the ranch's monthly needs, and Mamie looked at the numbers and did the mental calculation quickly and felt something loosen slightly in her chest, the first loosening in 10 days. It would not solve everything immediately. The debt was still there, but it would buy time. Real time, enough time to work with rather than against. "I can fill this," she said. "I will need to establish an account with the grain supplier in Abilene to guarantee the quantities, which requires a deposit." "How much?" he asked. She told him. He reached into his coat and put the cash on the table without hesitating. Mamie stared at the money. Then she looked at him. "That is more than I asked for." "The surplus is an advance against the first month's order," he said. "Standard business practice." It was not standard business practice. It was a man finding every available logical framework to wrap around what was, essentially, an act of extraordinary generosity, and she knew it, and he knew that she knew it, and he held her gaze with a steadiness that did not ask her to acknowledge it. "Thank you," she said. She said it simply, without qualifications or deflections, because he had offered her the same directness, and it seemed like the least she could do. Something changed in his expression when she said that. Something small and brief and quickly controlled, but she saw it, a kind of surprised warmth, as though he had not quite expected to be thanked simply and directly and had been moved by it more than he expected. "One more thing," he said, gathering himself. "I need someone who understands supply logistics and can manage the inventory ordering for the ranch. My foreman is good with cattle, but numbers confuse him. I was wondering if you would be willing to consult on that. A few hours a week, compensated fairly." Mamie Dawson stared at him. This man had walked into her store twice, looked at her twice with that unsettling, careful attention, asked her once if she was all right, and was now systematically constructing a scaffold of practical arrangements that, taken together, would hold her store and her life together at the exact moment they had been about to collapse. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. It came out more plainly than she intended, without the professional buffer she usually maintained. He was quiet for a moment, and in that quiet she got the first real sense of Luke Alden as a person rather than a transaction, the solitude in him, the same quality of bearing weight alone that she carried in herself, the particular silence of someone who has learned to hold things together without anyone watching. "Because you are clearly very good at this," he said finally, "and it would be a waste." That was true, but it was not the whole truth, and they both knew it, and she decided that was enough for now. Over the following weeks, something began to happen that neither of them quite acknowledged. Mamie reorganized the Alden Ranch's supply chain with a methodical efficiency that apparently astonished Luke's foreman, a weathered old rancher named Pete Garrity who had expected a shop girl, and received instead a woman who could read a feed quantity chart, calculate seasonal demand, and flag ordering inefficiencies within 20 minutes of sitting down with the records. She came out to the ranch twice a week on a borrowed horse, a gentle bay mare named Dory from the livery stable where Cody worked, and she sat at the big table in the ranch's main house with the supply books spread out around her, and worked through the numbers with a focus and a pleasure that she had not felt in years, because this was pure problem-solving without the shadow of catastrophe hanging over it, and it turned out that she was very, very good at it. Luke would come in and out of the room during those sessions, always busy, always managing something on the ranch, but always finding a reason to pause at the table and look at what she was working on and ask a question that was sometimes genuinely practical and sometimes, she suspected, an excuse to linger. She told herself she was imagining the second kind. One afternoon in late July, he brought 2 cups of coffee to the table without being asked and set one in front of her and sat down across from her, and she realized with a small internal jolt that he was not going to ask a practical question this time. "How did you learn to do all this?" he asked. He was looking at the spread of papers before her, at the system she had built from what had been a chaotic pile of receipts and estimates. "The accounting, the logistics. Did someone teach you?" "My father," she said. "He taught me the basics when I was young because he liked to talk through problems and I was always there. Then he died and I had to teach myself the rest." "How old were you when he died?" 19. Luke was quiet. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup and looked at it. "I was 29 when my father died," he said. "I thought that was too young to take all this on. I cannot imagine doing it at 19. "You do not have much of a choice," she said. "When it falls to you, it falls to you." "No," he agreed. "You do not." He looked up at her. "But most people, when something is too heavy, they let it show. They ask for help. You do not." She looked at him steadily. "You did not either," she said. "You told me 2 years of running this ranch alone." "I had Pete," he said, "and I had the men. I was not exactly alone." "But there was no one you could actually tell," she said, and she did not quite know why she said it, and the directness of it surprised them both. Luke Alden looked at her across the table with that deep Creekwater gaze, and she saw it again, that surprised warmth, the way a door opens on a room that has been closed for a long time, and the light falls in for the first time and illuminates things that were always there. "No," he said quietly. "No, there was not." They sat in that acknowledgement for a moment, and it was the first time in longer than Mamie could remember that she had sat in the presence of another person's loneliness and recognized it as matching her own, and she felt the strange, frightening pull of it, frightening, because she did not have the vocabulary for it anymore, because she had spent so long not needing things that she was not sure she knew how to need something safely. She gathered her papers and said she needed to be getting back to town before the afternoon rush, which was not entirely untrue, and Luke walked her out to where Dory was hitched at the post, and she mounted up and he stood in the yard with his hat in his hands, and she felt his eyes on her back all the way down the long drive toward the road, and she did not let herself look back, though she wanted to. The following Tuesday, Cody found out. She had not intended for him to find out that way. She had planned, in a vague and continually postponed way, to tell him once things were more stable, once the arrangement with Luke Alden had had time to generate enough income to show a clear path forward. She had intended to control the information the same way she controlled everything else. But Cody had been talking to a hand at the livery who had been talking to someone at the bank, and the story had filtered down through 2 degrees of separation, and arrived at Cody Dawson in the garbled but essentially accurate form that the store had been in danger of foreclosure, and that Luke Alden had stepped in. He came into the store at closing time with his face closed down and his jaw set in the particular way he had inherited from their father, that flat expression that meant he was working very hard not to show how much something hurt. "Why did you not tell me?" he asked. Mamie set down the tin she was shelving. "Cody, I am 20 years old, Mamie. I have been working at the livery for 2 years. I have been putting money aside because I wanted to save up for it. Does not matter what I wanted to save up for. I had money. Not enough, maybe, but some. And you were going to let the store get taken without telling me." She looked at him and felt the familiar complicated ache that she always felt with Cody, the love of it and the weight of it, the way she had oriented the whole shape of her life around protecting him, and how that protection had, at some point, become its own kind of secret-keeping, its own kind of distance. "I did not want you to worry," she said. "That is not your decision to make," he said. "I am not a child. You cannot just decide that I get to be protected while you carry everything alone. That is not fair to you, and it is not fair to me." The word fair hit her in a way she had not expected, because it had simply never occurred to her to think about whether it was fair to herself. She had thought about what was necessary. She had thought about what would protect Cody. She had thought about what the families who depended on the store needed. She had not once thought about whether what she was doing to herself was fair. She sat down on the stool behind the counter, and for the first time in a very long time, she did not manage what was on her face quickly enough, and Cody saw it, the exhaustion and the grief, and the 4 years of accumulated weight, and his expression broke open. "Mamie," he said, differently now, softer. "I am fine," she started, and he shook his head sharply. "Stop doing that," he said. "Stop saying you are fine when you are not. It is just me. You do not have to be strong for me." She looked at her brother for a long moment, at the young man he had become without her quite noticing, broad-shouldered and steady, and looking at her right now with a care that was so genuine and uncomplicated that it cut right through every wall she had. "I do not know how to stop," she admitted, and it was the truest thing she had said out loud in years. They sat together for a long time after that, and Cody told her about the money he had saved, and she told him, finally, fully and honestly, the real shape of the debt and the arrangement with Luke Alden, and what the next few months needed to look like. And it was strange and uncomfortable, and also the first relief she had felt in years that was entirely clean, without the aftertaste of loneliness. She told Luke Alden about the conversation with Cody on her next visit to the ranch, not because she had planned to tell him, but because he asked. He asked the way he always asked, simply, directly, with that quality of attention that refused to accept surface answers. They were walking the edge of the north pasture while he showed her where a new section of fencing needed to go, because she had pointed out in the supply books that the cost of replacing strayed cattle far exceeded the cost of better fencing, and he had acknowledged the logic and wanted to talk through the project. "You seem lighter today," he said, not looking at her, watching the cattle moving slow and gold in the afternoon light. "I had a difficult conversation with my brother," she said. "It turned out to be overdue." "Difficult how?" she told him. She told him more than she planned to. The way the words sometimes came out in his presence at a volume she did not quite expect, the 4 years of silence, the management, the choosing over and over to be the person who held things together and never the person who asked for help, and how Cody's face had looked when he finally saw the truth of it. Luke listened the way he always listened, without interrupting, without filling the silence prematurely, with his hat in his hands and his eyes on the long grass moving in the summer wind. "When my father was dying," he said, when she was finished, "he spent 3 weeks giving me instructions. Every morning, new instructions. How to manage the hands, how to negotiate with the cattle buyers in Wichita, how to handle a bad season, what to do with the north pasture in a drought year. He was very thorough." He paused. "He never once asked me how I felt about any of it." Mamie looked at him. The late afternoon light was on his face, and she could see the careful way he was holding the memory, not bitterly but with a kind of settled sadness. "He loved me," Luke said. "I know that without any doubt." But love did not occur to him as something you expressed by asking someone how they were doing. It occurred to him as something you expressed by teaching them what they needed to know to survive. He looked at her. "I think you grew up in a similar household." She thought about her father, his enormous warmth, his laughter, his terrible head for money, the way he had never once sat down and asked Mamie what she was afraid of or what she wanted. The way love in that house had always been expressed as provision and protection and practical management. "Yes," she said, "I think I did." They stood in the north pasture with the summer evening coming in around them and the cattle moving slow and the grass rustling, and she felt, with an unsettling and clarifying certainty, that this man understood the architecture of her interior life in a way that she had never expected another person to understand, and that this was both wonderful and absolutely terrifying. It was Pete Garrity, Luke's foreman, who accelerated things, though not intentionally. Pete was a good man, 70% practical good sense and 30% meddlesome opinion, and he had been watching Luke Alden for 2 months now with the calculating attention of a man who has worked for a family long enough to feel entitled to an opinion on personal matters. He cornered Mamie at the supply table one afternoon in August while Luke was out with the herd. "You know that boy is half out of his mind over you," Pete said, with the directness of a man who considers diplomacy a waste of everyone's time. Mamie looked up from the grain ledger. "Mr. Garrity." "I have worked for the Alden family for 15 years, Pete said, settling into a chair with the confidence of territorial occupation. "I worked for Edmund for 13 years, and I have worked for Luke for 2. I have never seen that man drive into town 3 times in 2 weeks to check on a supply order that any of the hands could have handled. He is establishing a business arrangement. He rode out to the south fence yesterday and came back 2 hours early because, and I quote, he thought you might have a question about the August grain order and wanted to be available." Pete looked at her with the supremely unsentimental expression of a man who has seen many things. "Miss Dawson, the August grain order has not changed since July." Mamie set down her pencil. She thought about what she felt when Luke walked into a room, the way the quality of the air seemed to shift slightly, become more oxygenated. She thought about the North Pasture conversation, about the particular agony of being understood. She thought about all the reasons this was complicated. The difference in their circumstances, his ranch and her struggling store, the way power imbalances could curdle generosity into something darker, all the 1,000 careful practical objections she could assemble. And underneath all those objections, the truth she had been carefully not looking at directly, that she had not thought about anything but Luke Alden with any real sustained pleasure in 2 months, and that this was the most alive she had felt in years, and that it frightened her precisely because of how much she wanted it. "He is a good man," she said, carefully neutral. Pete snorted. "He is a lonely man who has been holding himself together with both hands since his father died, and who lights up like a lantern every time you ride up the drive. And you are a woman who has been carrying more than her share for so long she has forgotten. She is allowed to put some of it down." He stood up, apparently satisfied with having delivered this assessment. "In my professional opinion, which nobody asked for, you two ought to stop being so terrifyingly self-contained at each other and have a real conversation." He walked out, and Mamie sat alone with the grain ledger and thought, with a clarity that was both terrifying and exhilarating, that Pete Garrity was absolutely right. The opportunity presented itself that evening, when Luke came back from the south pasture and found Mamie still at the supply table, not because she had more work to do, but because she had been sitting there thinking and the thinking had not resolved into anything actionable, and she was not quite ready to ride back to town. He came in, poured water from the pitcher on the sideboard, drank it, set the cup down and turned and saw her still there. "I thought you would have left an hour ago," he said. "I was thinking," she said. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, unhurried, the way he always did. He did not ask what she was thinking about. He just sat there in the companionable quiet that had developed between them over 2 months of regular meetings and waited. She said, "Pete told me something today." "Pete tells everyone something every day," Luke said, without apparent alarm. "He has more opinions than a circuit court judge. He told me you drove into town 3 times last week to check on supply orders that did not require checking." The silence that followed was different from the comfortable kind. Luke looked at the table. Then he looked at her, and the careful composure that was his default expression was, for once, insufficient to the task. She could see through it to something unguarded and uncertain, which on his face was remarkable because she had never seen him uncertain about anything. "Pete is not wrong," he said. He is rarely wrong, which is his most irritating quality. Mamie felt her heart doing something loud and uninstructed in her chest. Luke, she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name, and they both noticed it. I need to be honest with you about something. All right, he said. He was very still. I have spent a very long time not allowing myself to want things, she said. Not allowing myself to need things. It became a habit, and habits become instincts, and I have been running on that instinct for so long that when something appears that I might actually want, my first response is to find every logical reason to not want it. Luke was looking at her with that full, careful attention. I am trying to stop doing that, she said. I thought you should know. He was quiet for a moment that felt very long. Then he said, What is it that you want, Mamie? The sound of her name in his voice, simply stated, without ornamentation, did something to the architecture of her composure that she was not entirely in control of. I think, she said, that I would like to find out what this is. Whatever this is, I would like to find out honestly without deciding in advance that it cannot be something, because I have been deciding in advance about too many things for too long. Luke Alden was quiet for another moment. Then he said, I have been wanting to ask you to dinner for 6 weeks. 6 weeks, she said. I kept talking myself out of it, he said. I was concerned about the business arrangement and whether it was appropriate to mix the two, and whether you might think I had arranged the supply contract as a means of— I did not think that, she said immediately. Good, he said, because I did not. He paused. Will you have dinner with me? Not here, not a working dinner. In town, Friday evening. Yes, she said. I will. The smile that moved across Luke Alden's face in that moment was not the polite professional expression she had seen most often, nor the brief controlled warmth she had caught glimpses of. It was a real, unguarded smile, the smile of a man who had not had much cause to smile like that in a long time, and it transformed his face so completely that Mamie felt a corresponding warmth move through her from the center outward. They had dinner at the Caldwell Hotel on Friday evening, which was the nearest thing the town had to a proper restaurant, and the food was simple but good, and the conversation was extraordinary, not because of any single remarkable thing that was said, but because of the quality of ease that had developed between them. The way two people who have spent considerable time in genuine communication arrive at a dinner table, already knowing the important things, and find themselves free to talk about the less important and delightful things. She found out that he had grown up reading every book that came through Caldwell, and had driven his father to distraction with his preference for reading over ranching in his adolescence, before he accepted that the land was genuinely his passion, and that the books just made him better at understanding it. He found out that she had wanted, at 14, to be a schoolteacher, and had been good at mathematics from the time she was very young, and had helped 3 of the younger children on her street learn their numbers before the weight of the store and the practicalities of survival had consumed that particular dream. You could still teach, he said. There is nothing stopping you. There is not enough time, she said. The store is doing better, he said. The arrangement with the ranch, the bank's payment plan, Cody helping now, things are more stable. She looked at her hands, then at him. Old habits, she said. Yes, he agreed. He reached across the table and covered her hands with his, a simple and deliberate gesture, and she felt it through her whole body. The habit of not allowing yourself things. She turned her hand over under his, and he laced their fingers together, and they sat like that for a moment that felt remarkably significant for how quiet it was. I would like to court you properly, he said, if you are willing. Openly in town, so there is no ambiguity about my intentions. She thought about ambiguity. She thought about the dark and hidden motive she had searched for when he first offered help, the trap she had expected to find underneath the generosity, because the world had taught her that help always has a cost. She had not found any dark past, any hidden agenda, any forced choice waiting at the bottom of his kindness. She had found a lonely, honest man who ran a ranch with integrity and understood loneliness because he carried his own. "Yes," she said, "I am willing." The months that followed were unlike anything Mamie Dawson had experienced since childhood, since before her mother died and the world became a thing that required managing rather than a thing that could be lived in. They were months in which she discovered, slowly, and with the caution of a person unlearning a long-held behavior, that it was possible to both be strong and also be held, that those two things were not mutually exclusive. That allowing someone to ask about her did not mean she was surrendering the capability that had kept her and Cody alive for 4 years. Luke came to Sunday dinner at the store, which had gradually expanded from a purely commercial space back into something closer to a home, as Mamie allowed herself that small luxury. He brought things, not expensive things, but specific things. A book he had seen at the Abilene Supply Post that had a chapter on supply chain mathematics that he thought she would find interesting. A jar of the honey that one of his hands kept bees for because she had mentioned once that she missed having it. Small attentions that said, with perfect clarity, that he had been listening and had remembered. She went to the ranch, and she learned the rhythms of it. The early dawn sounds of cattle and horses and men getting to work. The particular light on the Kansas grassland at different hours. The way the whole enormous place had its own logic that was not so different from the logic of a well-run store, everything in its place. Everything accounted for. A constant balance of input and output that required constant attention and rewarded careful thought. Luke was a good rancher in the same way she was a good store manager, not through natural ease but through disciplined love, through a willingness to do the unglamorous work because the thing itself was worth doing. She admired that enormously. She also admired, with an honesty she had decided to allow herself, the physical reality of him, the broad shoulders and the quiet confidence and the way his hands moved with absolute sureness on any task, and the way he looked at her, particularly, that quality of attention that had startled her in the beginning, and which she now recognized as simply the way Luke Alden loved things, with his full, undivided, committed focus. He kissed her for the first time on an October evening on the porch of the ranch house, with the first cold edge of autumn in the air, and the sky, enormous and star-crowded above the Kansas prairie. It was not a hesitant kiss or an uncertain one. It was the kiss of a man who had thought carefully and decided completely, and she kissed him back with the same wholeness, because she had done her own thinking and made her own decision, and was done with the habit of halfway. Cody, when she told him, was the most straightforwardly pleased she had ever seen him. He grinned in a way that reminded her so sharply of their father that it made her chest ache sweetly, and he shook his head and said, "I have been wondering when you were going to let something good happen to you, Mamie." And she laughed, which was something she was doing more of these days. November brought a crisis, because in the Wild West the year could not simply become quietly gracious without testing what had been built in it. The crisis arrived in the form of a man named Dolan Fletcher, who rode into Caldwell with a letter from a law firm in Kansas City claiming to be a creditor of Hector Dawson's, presenting a debt that Mamie had never heard of, for an amount that, if legitimate, would have undone everything the past months had accomplished. Mamie read the letter twice, then folded it, then sat down and thought carefully. The debt was dated to 1877, 5 years before her father's death. It was for a loan allegedly taken from a private lending concern in Kansas City. It bore her father's signature. She did not immediately panic. She went to the store's records, which she had organized meticulously, and she found the ledger from 1877, and she went through every entry for that year with methodical attention, looking for any record of a loan received or a debt acknowledged. She found nothing. She brought the letter and the ledger to Luke. He read it carefully, his expression neutral. "This could be legitimate," he said. "Your father was not known for careful record-keeping." "No," she agreed, "but he was known for telling me things eventually. He told me about the other 3 loans. Why would he hide this one? What is your instinct?" He asked, and the fact that he asked her instinct, not her analysis, Not her logical assessment, but her instinct was remarkable to her still. "My instinct is that it is fraudulent," she said. "The signature on this letter is close but not right. I know my father's handwriting. The angle of the capital H is wrong." Luke looked at her for a moment. "I want to send a telegram to a man I know in Kansas City," he said. "A lawyer named James Rourke. He handled my father's estate, and he knows how to investigate this kind of thing quickly." "That will cost money," she said immediately. "Mamie," he said, with the particular gentle firmness he had developed for the moments when she reflexively counted costs, "let me help with this." She had been getting better at this, at letting him help, at not automatically converting every offered hand into a calculation of what it would cost to accept it. It was still not entirely comfortable, but she was better. "All right," she said. "Yes, thank you." James Rourke was as efficient as Luke had promised. Within 2 weeks, the telegram came back with findings that confirmed what Mamie's instinct had told her. The lending concern listed on the letter had been dissolved in 1875, 2 years before the supposed loan. The signature was a forgery. Dahl & Fletcher had attempted the same scheme against 2 other estates in the region and had been arrested in Missouri the previous month. The threat dissolved like a fever breaking, and Mamie sat in the back room of the store with the telegram in her hand and laughed. A short, sharp, slightly disbelieving laugh. Because of course there had to be one final test, one last attempt by the universe to pull down what she had spent all year building, and it had failed, and things were going to be all right. Luke came to hear the news, and he held her face in his hands and looked at her for a long moment before he said anything. "It is over," he said. "It is over," she agreed. "Good," he said, and kissed her. December came in cold and clear, and Christmas in Caldwell was a modest thing but a warm one, the kind of warmth that comes from community rather than abundance. The small church decorated with pine branches, the families gathering with what they had, the particular generosity that small western towns generated in the lean seasons from a combination of necessity and genuine human decency. Mamie decorated the store, which was doing measurably better. The arrangement with the Alden ranch had stabilized the revenue enough to allow a serious payment plan with the bank, and with Cody, now formally involved in the business. He had a head for figures that he had apparently been hiding under his easygoing exterior. The operation was leaner and better organized than it had ever been under Hector Dawson's beloved but chaotic management. The Garcias and the Havorsons and the Bruners were still shopping there, still on credit extended with genuine goodwill rather than bookkeeping resentment, and Mamie had found ways to make those credit arrangements sustainable rather than the open-ended kindness that had helped sink her father. On Christmas Eve, Luke came to town with a wagon full of gifts from the ranch for the store families, practical things, beef cuts and preserved fruit, and a bolt of warm wool, and he and Mamie distributed them together, going from door to door in the cold evening air with their breath making small clouds and the stars burning blue-white overhead. It was Mrs. Garcia who took Mamie's arm as they were leaving and said, with the directness of a woman who has seen enough of life to say what needs saying, "You look happy, Mija. You have not always looked happy." Mamie thought about that. She thought about what happy felt like, how unfamiliar it had been, how it had crept in over these months not as a sudden brightness, but as a gradual accumulation of warmth, small moments stacking up until they were too many to dismiss or minimize or attribute to something else. "I am," she said. "I am happy." That night, after the rounds were done, and Cody had gone to spend Christmas Eve with the friends he had accumulated at the livery, Luke and Mamie sat by the small stove in the back room of the store with cups of coffee and the particular comfortable silence that belongs to 2 people who have learned each other well enough to rest in it. He reached into his coat pocket and brought out a small box and set it on the table between them. Mamie looked at the box. She looked at him. "I had this planned differently," he said. "I had a speech prepared. Pete helped me with it, which in retrospect was an error because Pete's speechwriting is about as subtle as his opinions." He paused. I am going to just say the thing directly, which is what I should have planned to do from the beginning. Say the thing, she said. I love you, he said, simply and without ceremony. I have loved you since approximately the second time I walked into your store and you looked at me like someone who was managing an enormous amount and was not about to explain it to anyone. I understood that look. I wanted to understand it better. I want to spend a considerable amount of time understanding you better. He nodded at the box. Will you marry me, Mamie? She opened the box. Inside was a ring not ostentatious, not the kind of thing designed to impress from across a room, but a beautifully made thing. A gold band with a small garnet that caught the stove light and held it, warm and deep red. She thought about the girl she had been at 19, standing in a store full of her dead father's debts, and deciding without anyone asking her to that she would carry it. She thought about all the years of carrying, the silence and the management and the practiced steadiness, and she thought about Luke Alden walking through the door and asking, with such simple directness, if she was all right, the first person in years to ask, the first person in longer than that to wait for a real answer rather than a managed one. Yes, she said, of course, yes. He put the ring on her finger and she looked at it, and then she looked at him, and there were no words sufficient to the moment, so she did not attempt them. She leaned across the small table and kissed him, and he kissed her back, and the stove crackled and the Kansas winter pressed against the windows, and inside it was warm. They married in the Caldwell Church in late February 1883, in the thin, pale sunlight of a winter that was finally beginning to release its hold on the prairie. And the ceremony was attended by essentially the entire town, because Mamie Dawson had spent 4 years being a consistent and reliable presence in all of their lives, and they felt proprietary about her happiness in the way that small communities do. Mrs. Garcia sat in the front pew and cried openly and without apology. Pete Garrity sat in the back row and appeared to be examining the ceiling with great interest to avoid showing any visible emotion, and failed. Cody walked Mamie down the aisle, and when they reached Luke at the altar, Cody shook Luke's hand with a seriousness that made Luke meet his eyes and nod, a transaction of trust and responsibility that required no words. The minister spoke the old words, and the congregation listened, and Mamie and Luke said their vows to each other with the directness that characterized everything between them, looking at each other rather than at any particular point in the distance, present and clear and certain. After the ceremony, there was a gathering at the store. Cody had organized it, with a competence that was becoming more characteristic by the day, with food brought by half the town, including an extraordinary pie from Mrs. Haverson that turned out to be the subject of awed conversation for weeks afterward. Luke danced with Mamie on the cleared floor of the store, while someone played a fiddle with considerable enthusiasm, if not consistent accuracy, and she laughed at something he said close to her ear, and the sound of her laughing was so unguarded and genuine that 3 separate people nearby turned to look, not intrusively but the way people turn toward warmth. They moved to the ranch after the wedding, which meant some reorganization of the store's operations. Cody, with genuine eagerness, took on more of the management, and Mamie continued to handle the supply contracts and the accounting, but from the ranch rather than from the cramped back room that had been her home for 4 years. The ranch house was larger than she had expected, its interiors plain but solid, built for permanence, with rooms that had stood empty since Edmund Alden died because Luke lived in a portion of it and the rest had simply waited. Mamie found herself moving through those rooms with a slow, considering attention, seeing what was there and what the spaces wanted to become, and it was the first home she had shaped for reasons other than pure survival. She put books on shelves and a good rug in the parlor and planted seeds for a kitchen garden in the space behind the house, planning for the spring with a lightheartedness that was new to her and that she was learning to trust. Spring of 1883 was beautiful on the Kansas grassland, the kind of spring that made the whole previous winter seem like a story rather than a recent reality, the grass coming in green and thick, the cattle fat and content, the sky an implausible shade of blue above the enormous prairie. Mamie was in the kitchen garden on an April morning, her sleeves rolled up and her hands in the earth, when she realized that she was not just content but genuinely, uncomplicatedly happy, and that this was no longer a surprise to her. It had become, in the past months, simply the texture of her days. It had become ordinary in the best possible sense of the word. She heard Luke come around the side of the house and she looked up, and he was carrying 2 cups of coffee, and he had the same expression on his face that she had noticed becoming his default expression, that particular warmth that had once been so surprising and that she now recognized as simply Luke, simply the man she loved looking at her. He crouched down beside the garden and handed her the coffee and looked at what she had planted. "Tomatoes?" he asked. "Tomatoes and beans and squash," she said. "And I am going to try sweet corn in the south corner. My mother used to grow sweet corn," he said. He said it simply, without the careful distance he had once maintained from memories of his parents, and she understood the significance of that ease. She said the trick was planting it in blocks so it pollinates properly. "I read the same thing," she said, "in the Agricultural Digest you brought me from Abilene." He smiled. She loved his smiles, the full ones, the ones she had worked to earn and that still felt like gifts. "Luke," she said, with a particular quality in her voice that made him look at her more carefully. "Yes," he said. He was very good at hearing things unsaid. "I think we are going to need to prepare a room," she said. "In the house. One of the empty ones." He looked at her for a moment in the quiet morning with the garden around them and the prairie stretching out in all directions and the cattle calling somewhere distant. "Mamie," he said. "March," she said. "I think." He set down his coffee with great care, as though setting down a cup of something irreplaceable, and he took her face in his hands, both of them. The way he had the night the Fletcher business was resolved, with that same quality of held attention, and he looked at her with an expression so open and unguarded and grateful that she felt it move through her like something warm and entirely clean. "Are you all right?" he asked. He asked it the way he had asked it the very first time, in the store, before they knew each other, with that same simple directness that had startled her so completely. But this time the question had a different shape, a different weight, not the weight of a stranger observing distress, but the weight of a husband asking his wife, the person he loved, the person whose interior life he had made it his sustained practice to attend to. She took one of his hands in both of hers. "I am better than all right," she said. "I am wonderful." He laughed, surprised by it, and pulled her close, and she settled against him in the garden with the spring morning around them and the future opening forward like the prairie, enormous and good. The summer was full and busy in the particular way that ranch summers are, the constant motion of cattle management and fence maintenance, and the rhythms of the land that wait for no one's convenience. Pete Garrity was visibly more content since the wedding, as though the successful resolution of what he had apparently considered a crisis of prolonged loneliness in 2 perfectly suited people gave him personal satisfaction. He ran the daily operations with his usual efficient opinionation and treated Mamie with a combination of gruff respect and quiet protectiveness that she found entirely endearing. Cody came out to the ranch regularly, and he and Luke developed a rapport that Mamie watched with deep pleasure, the younger man and the older, both of them carrying versions of the same loss and the same self-reliance, finding in each other a kind of easy camaraderie that did not require explanation. Cody had a girl he was sweet on, the daughter of the town's new schoolteacher, a serious and bright young woman named Clara Brennan, who apparently shared Cody's fondness for figures and horses and direct conversation. Mamie watched her brother navigate the earliest territories of this interest with the particular amusement of someone who has recently been through the same territory and recognizes every landmark. "You should just tell her," Mamie said, on one of Cody's visits in June when he had spent 20 minutes talking about Clara without technically saying anything about Clara. "Directly, just say the thing." "That is easy for you to say," Cody said. You found someone who," he stopped, changed direction. "It is complicated." "It is only as complicated as you make it," Mamie said, with all the authority of a woman who had made it maximally complicated and learned from the experience. He asked Clara to Sunday dinner by the end of July. Clara accepted. Mamie considered this a complete success. August brought heat and the approaching reality of the baby. And Mamie, who had been essentially impossible to slow down, was compelled by the simple logistics of her body to concede that certain activities required modification. She continued to handle the accounting and the supply contracts from the ranch, and Cody, now genuinely excellent at the store's day-to-day operations, barely needed her intervention. The Dawson General Store was stable and solvent and beginning, carefully, to grow. She also, in those long, warm August evenings on the ranch house porch, began to teach. She had not planned it exactly. She had mentioned to Luke, one evening, that she still thought about the schoolteacher dream, and he had mentioned that 3 of the ranch hands had children who were not yet school age and would need instruction before the Caldwell school could be reached. And one thing led to another in the practical way that things tended to lead between them. And within 3 weeks, there was a regular afternoon session on the ranch house porch that was attended by 4 children between the ages of 5 and 9, who learned their letters and their numbers from Mamie Dawson Alden in the long Kansas afternoons. She was extraordinarily good at it. She had a patience with children that surprised her, a capacity for explaining things in multiple ways until the right frame clicked for each particular child, and a genuine delight in the moment of understanding that she recognized as one of the most satisfying things she had ever experienced. Luke watched from the doorway sometimes, leaning against the frame with his arms folded and his hat pushed back, and she could feel his particular attention from across the yard without looking up, warm and constant in hers. Their son was born in early November 1883, at the start of the month when the cold had come in properly and the prairie was brown and brittle and still. The birth was attended by the town's doctor, who had come out from Caldwell with characteristic pragmatic efficiency, and by Mrs. Garcia, who had appointed herself a necessary presence and was entirely correct to do so. The boy was large and healthy, and howled his objections to the entire proceedings with a vigor that Pete Garrity, waiting outside in the cold with several of the hands, heard from 100 feet away, and responded to with the first unreservedly broad smile anyone had seen on his face in recent memory. Luke held his son for the first time with the same quality of careful, complete attention he brought to everything he loved, and he looked at the child and then at Mamie, and he said nothing because there was nothing adequate, and she understood and felt the same. They named him Edmund Hector Alden for both their fathers, because it seemed right to honor the stubborn and imperfect love of the men who had shaped them, and to give their son a name that contained that history while the life ahead of him was his own to fill. Eddie, as he was immediately called by everyone on the ranch including Pete, who claimed to disapprove of nicknames and used it within 48 hours, was a cheerful and robust infant who appeared to have inherited Luke's equanimity and Mamie's alertness, and who was passed between the ranch's entire population with the proprietary enthusiasm that large, remote ranch communities develop for any new small person who arrives in their midst. The winter of 1883 going into 1884 was the gentlest Mamie could remember, though the year before had been gentler still, because she had not yet been paying attention to gentleness. She paid attention now. She had learned to pay attention to the good things, to not file them away as provisional or contingent, to not hold them at arm's length against the possibility of loss. She held Eddie in the rocking chair by the parlor window while the snow came down soft and slow over the prairie, and Luke sat across the room with a book, one of the ones they had accumulated together on the shelves she had put up in the fall, and the stove was warm and the ranch was quiet, and she thought about the girl who had stood in the general store 4 years ago and decided, in the absence of any other option, to be strong enough for everything. She thought about what strength meant now, how it had changed shape in her understanding. It was not the same as invulnerability. It was not the same as self-sufficiency. Strength was waking up and choosing every morning to be fully present to your life, to the difficulties and the griefs and the pleasures and the loves, without managing any of them into something smaller and safer than they were. She had learned that, slowly and with considerable difficulty, from a rancher who had walked into her store and asked if she was all right, and meant it, and waited for the real answer. Spring of 1884 brought growth in every direction. The kitchen garden expanded. The teaching sessions on the porch expanded to include 2 children from neighboring homestead families whose parents had heard about them and asked, with careful pride, whether there was room. There was always room. The Caldwell General Store, under Cody's increasingly confident management, began the year well in the black for the first time in its history, and Cody used the margin to do what their father had never managed to do: establish a proper credit system with clear terms and genuine tracking that made the extended credit sustainable rather than a slow drain. The Garcias and the Havorsons and the Bruners could still shop there, could still count on fair prices and genuine goodwill, but now the books actually balanced. Cody had asked Clara Brennan to marry him in December, with, as far as Mamie could determine, exactly the directness she had recommended, and Clara had accepted with equal directness, and they were planning a spring wedding that Mamie was helping organize with a pleasure that was entirely genuine. Watching her brother find his happiness was one of the sweeter satisfactions of the year, partly because she recognized in his cautious wonder at being loved the same wonder she had felt herself, and knew he would grow into it the way she had. Luke expanded the ranch's north pasture fence, using the supply arrangement with the store and Mamie's careful logistics planning to keep costs well under the estimates, and brought in 20 additional head to the spring herd, which Pete acknowledged was a sound decision, using approximately 7 times as many words as necessary. On a May evening, when Eddie was 6 months old and the prairie was green and enormous, and the evening light had that particular quality of Kansas spring that looked like it was illuminating everything from the inside, Mamie and Luke sat on the porch of the ranch house, and she held the baby against her chest and he sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched, and the silence between them was the fullest silence she had ever known, not empty, not the silence of things unsaid, but the silence of everything said and heard and held. "What are you thinking?" he asked. She considered the question honestly. "I am thinking about the ledger," she said. He raised an eyebrow. "Not the financial one, a different kind. All the things I thought I could not have, that I had decided in advance were not possible: this house, this life, someone to think about me specifically instead of everyone else. I'm thinking about how wrong I was and how glad I am to have been wrong." Luke was quiet for a moment. "You were not wrong to be cautious," he said. "You had good reason." "I know," she said, "but I was wrong to stop there, to mistake caution for the whole answer." He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and Eddie made the small content sounds of a baby, entirely at peace with his circumstances. And the sun went down over the Kansas prairie in a blaze of orange and deep rose that painted the whole sky and the whole grass and the whole enormous world in the colors of something ending beautifully and something else beginning. Cody and Clara married in June, a ceremony that was warm and simple and very happy, and afterward the 2 families, the Aldens and the Dawsons, the ranch and the store and everything they had built between them, gathered for a supper that lasted until well after dark and produced more laughter and more dancing and more purely good feeling than any evening Mamie could remember. She danced with Luke and with Cody and with Pete Garrity, who turned out, to everyone's considerable surprise, to be an accomplished dancer, and she danced holding Eddie, who was at that age of discovering everything, and responded to the music with a bouncing enthusiasm that suggested he would be dancing properly before he was walking. That night, riding back to the ranch in the wagon under a sky so full of stars it seemed competitive. Eddie asleep between them, Luke said. "Are you happy?" And she said, "Yes," simply and without qualification, and meant it with her whole self. The years moved forward with the beautiful momentum of a life being fully lived. Eddie grew into a boy of astonishing curiosity and remarkable stubbornness. Luke's equanimity, Mamie had concluded, was a layer applied over a substrate of considerable determination, and Eddie appeared to have received the substrate without yet developing the layer. He followed Luke around the ranch from the time he could walk, insisting on understanding every operation, and he sat in on Mamie's teaching sessions with an attention that suggested he was not just learning from them but filing the information for future use. Clara and Cody welcomed a daughter in 1885, a girl named Harriet who arrived with dark hair and bright eyes, and immediately became the object of Eddie's fascinated and slightly bossy attention. Mamie watched the two cousins navigate the complicated small diplomacy of childhood with a love that was so large it sometimes caught her off guard, the way large things will. In the spring of 1886, Mamie discovered that Edmund Hector Alden was going to have a sibling. She told Luke on a March morning very similar to the one 2 years before, in the kitchen garden again, with the same quality of spring light and the same coffee and the same particular quality of his attention when he understood what she was telling him. "Are you all right?" he asked, the same question, the same voice. "I am extraordinary," she said, and they both laughed. The second child arrived in October 1886, a girl this time, as small and fierce as her brother was large and determined, with Mamie's dark eyes and Luke's particular expression of quiet deliberation that she wore even as a newborn, looking at the world with a focused consideration that made Pete say she was going to be the smartest person on the ranch within 3 years, which Mamie thought was probably accurate. They named her Frances Eliza Alden, Frances for no particular family reason, just because it suited her, and Eliza for Luke's mother, whom Mamie had never met but whose presence she felt in the ranch house in the objects and the arrangements that remained from her time there. Franny, as she was called, and Eddie found an equilibrium within a few months that managed to be both genuinely affectionate and constantly argumentative, which the adults around them recognized as the signature of a sibling relationship that would last a lifetime. By 1887, the Alden Ranch was one of the most efficiently run operations in southern Kansas. Mamie's supply chain management and accounting systems had been refined over 4 years to something that Pete told visiting ranchers about with the proprietary pride of a man who wants credit for recognizing good work before anyone else did. The ranch was profitable and the crew was loyal and the cattle were healthy, and the north pasture fence that had been such a concern in 1883 had been expanded twice. The Dawson General Store was, under Cody's full management, a fixture of Caldwell's commercial life. The credit system was a model that 2 other merchants in the county had asked to learn from, because it balanced genuine community support with financial sustainability in a way that had not been obvious to anyone until Mamie made it obvious. She still handled the store's major accounting quarterly, rode over with Cody's records spread on the ranch table, and went through them the same way she had gone through Luke's supply books in that first summer. And the numbers were good, consistently and reliably good, and she allowed herself the satisfaction of that. She had also, through gradual and undramatic expansion, become something closer to a proper teacher. The porch sessions had grown into a formal arrangement with 3 homestead families and 2 of the ranch hands' families, meeting 4 afternoons a week, and she had a curriculum now and real books. Luke had ordered a set from a publisher in Kansas City, and she was teaching 8 children between 4 and 12 years old in a structure that was as good as many formal schools and better than some. She thought sometimes about the girl who had dreamed of being a school teacher at 14, and how that girl would have felt knowing that the dream had not died, only deferred, only waiting in the back room of a difficult decade for the moment when there was space for it. On the 5th anniversary of the day, Luke Alden walked into the Caldwell General Store and looked at Mamie Dawson with that careful attention. They rode out to the north pasture in the late afternoon, just the two of them, with Cannon and Dory stepping easy through the long summer grass, and they sat at the top of the small rise that gave the best view of the ranch. The house and the outbuildings and the cattle spread across the green, and the wide Kansas sky above it all. "Do you remember the first time you came into the store?" Mamie asked. "I remember everything about it," he said. "You looked at me like I was a transaction you needed to complete efficiently." "You were," she said. "Until you were not." He looked at her with that same deep attention, the creek-water eyes that had once surprised her and were now as familiar and essential as anything in her life. "Do you know when I knew?" he said. "Not when I first noticed you, but when I knew. Tell me." "When you thanked me," he said. "After the first offer, you just said thank you without managing it into something smaller, without deflecting. You just said it simply and directly and meant it." He paused. "It was such a small thing, but it told me everything. That there was a person underneath the managing who was completely genuine, who just needed space to be in." He looked at the ranch spread below them. "I wanted to be that space." She reached over and took his hand, the way she had first done at the dinner table in the Caldwell Hotel in 1882, the gesture that had felt so significant then, and was now simply the reaching out of someone who loves and knows where their person is. "You are," she said. "You have been." The sun moved toward the western horizon, and the light went golden and slow across the grass and the cattle, and the ranch below them was everything they had built together, not just the land and the operation and the accounts, but the life inside it, the children and the teaching and the friendship and the love, the daily practice of paying attention to each other, of asking and answering honestly, of being known. Mamie Dawson had been strong for everyone else for a very long time. She had carried what needed carrying and managed what needed managing, and held herself together with both hands because there had been no one else to hold the other side. And then a rancher had walked into her store and asked if she was all right, and waited for the real answer. And the real answer had turned out to be the beginning of everything she had not known she was allowed to want. She was 30 years old in the autumn of 1889, and she was sitting on the porch of the ranch house with Franny in her lap, and Eddie sprawled on the steps working through a mathematics problem she had assigned him, and Luke was somewhere behind her in the house, and she could hear him moving, that familiar sound of his particular presence. And Pete was crossing the yard with his characteristic "I am going somewhere important" stride, and the prairie was gold and brown in the late season light. And it was ordinary. It was ordinary in the most extraordinary way, the way things become when they are fully yours, when they have been earned and chosen and built with care, when the life around you is genuinely the life you are living rather than the life you are managing for other people while your own waits. Luke came out with coffee. He always brought coffee. It was one of his languages. And he handed her a cup, and he sat down beside her on the bench that he had built in the second year they were married because the single chair was insufficient and the view deserved to be shared. Eddie looked up from his mathematics and then went back to it with the selective attention of a child who has determined that the adults are not doing anything immediately relevant. "Pete says the South herd is looking good for the autumn sale," Luke said. "I looked at the numbers last week," she said. "They are looking better than last year." "Better than last year," he agreed. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, the baby warm between them. And Eddie solved his problem and announced the solution with a satisfaction that was entirely genuine and entirely Luke. And the afternoon light moved slow across the Kansas prairie, and everything that had been broken was whole, and everything that had been lost was found, and the life they had built together was large enough to hold all of it, the past and the present and the enormous, open, unhurried future. There were no debts left unpaid. There were no secrets left between them. There were no parts of herself she kept in reserve or managed into smaller shapes to keep them safe. She was fully here, fully seen, fully loved. She had been strong for everyone else for so long, and the rancher had been the first to ask about her, and she had learned, slowly and completely and forever, that being asked and answering was not a surrender. It was the most courageous thing she had ever done. Franny made a small sound of contentment in her arms. Luke pressed his lips to her temple. Eddie announced that he thought he had found a faster method and was going to prove it. The sun went down over Kansas in fire and rose gold, and the stars came out one by one, and the ranch settled into the quiet of evening, and Mamie Alden sat on her porch with her family around her and felt, deep and certain and permanent, the absolute peace of a life fully claimed.